Today we'll be talking about neurons and neurotransmission, which will cover the structures and functions of neurons as well as how neurons communicate with each other. So let's start with the structure and functions. The neuron is a specialized nerve cell. It processes and transmits information. And like a lot of other animal cells, it does a number of things that most of them do. It contains a nucleus, for example. It has a fatty membrane that separates the intracellular and extracellular fluids. It performs a bunch of usual tasks that all cells do. It does basic housekeeping functions, metabolic function. It helps protein manufacturing, or it manufactures proteins, I should say. But it does some other things as well. It's unlike other cells in a few ways. So, for example, it includes branches. Like these branches are axons, and dendrites are the other branches. And these pass information to and receive information from other cells. So the axon itself transmits information to other neurons, and the dendrites receive input from other neurons. So imagine there's another neuron here. A chemical messenger goes across the space here between, it's called a synapse, between these two, and the dendrites pick up the information. That information then gets propagated down the axon and out other axon terminals to other dendrites. In addition to these neurons, there are glial cells. These form a framework that basically hold the neurons in place and create tight connections with the blood vessels, especially the ones that serve the brain and the blood-brain barrier. It also, these glial cells, tend to clean up debris where neurons have been damaged. The glia, these glial cells, in other words, form a myelin sheath. The sheath serves to basically insulate the axons. So you can see those around here, the glial cells of the glial sheath. Here's the axon. And it speeds up the transmission of electrical impulses along the axons. These are referred to as white matter. So glial cells are typically what we refer to as the white matter in the brain, whereas the neurons are referred to as the gray matter in the brain. So myelin is found throughout the brain and spinal cord, and it forms scar tissue when it's damaged and interferes with transmission later on. In the rest of the nervous system, it does not do that. The axon, which we described before, is responsible for transmitting information from one neuron to another neuron. So some of these axons are myelinated, that is, have that fatty sheath along them, and some are not. But that myelin tends to speed up electrical transmission. The axon contains what are called synaptic vesicles, and these synaptic vesicles contain chemical messengers, or what are called neurotransmitters. These transmit signals between neurons. So you can see that here. Here are the synaptic vesicles. The synaptic gap is where chemicals actually go from one synaptic vesicle to the dendrite or dendrites, I should say, of another neuron here. Those dendrites have receptor cells on them, and looking for my pointer here, and the chemicals that come out of the synapse here, the synaptic vesicle here, go across the synaptic gap and bind with these receptor cells on the dendrite. And basically that's how neurotransmitters communicate with receptors on the dendrites of other neurons. The dendrite is the part of the neural cell body that receives input from other neurons. So remember, we showed the axons and the axon terminals. These are the dendrites. The neurotransmitters from the sending neuron communicate with receptors on the dendrites of other neurons. These nerve impulses usually travel from the dendrites and the cell body to the branching ends of the axon. So it's really a two-step process when you think about how neurons communicate with each other. The first is electrical signaling. And during electrical signaling, basically what happens is an action potential takes place in the signaling neuron's axon. That neuron generates an electrical signal known as an action potential, and the signal travels the length of the axon from its junction with the cell body to its terminal. So it's basically the action potential travels along the whole axon. Then there are chemical signals that happen, and these take place between two neurons. So the arrival of an action potential at an axon terminal releases neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters float across the extracellular fluid between the two neurons. The neurotransmitters basically make it so that the second neuron responds with its own action potential and sends that message along to the next neuron. So you can see how messages sort of propagate along from one neuron to another. Within the neuron, it has this action potential, basically an electrical sort of charge that propagates down the axon, basically across the nerve. And then when it's time to go from one neuron to another, there's this chemical messenger that occurs, and it jumps a gap between those two neurons and communicates that way. Once it's received by the next neuron, it continues with an electrical impulse till it gets to the end of that thing. Then there's a chemical messenger that's released again. That's picked up by the following neuron, and it goes on and on and on. So when the neuron isn't processing information, it's basically at rest. And of course, when a cell's at rest, the difference between the readings of the interior of the axon and the exterior fluid is known as a resting potential. So the interior of a neuron is typically negatively charged relative to its exterior. In fact, you can sort of see how this happens along here. At point 1, the sodium channels open and sodium rushes in, right? Down here, it's just sort of a resting potential. At point 2, potassium channels open and potassium starts to leave the cell. At point 3, the sodium channels close, and then at point 4, the potassium channels close, and you go back to basically a resting type of potential situation. So neurons respond to incoming chemical signals by becoming either depolarized or hyperpolarized. So when it's depolarized by a certain amount, it then reaches a threshold, and this initiates events that produce the action potential. So the size and the shape of the action potentials are always the same. You're either firing or you're not firing. And either the action potential occurs or the cell remains at rest. There's no middle ground between these two things. These action potentials are what are called all or none. It's not just that an action potential is sort of somewhat activated. It's either happening or it isn't. And there's an example of these things here on that particular web link. So when it comes to electrical signaling, basically how the signal gets down the axon, these action potentials don't affect the entire axon at once, but instead it propagates. So you could see here what ends up happening is as the action potential starts, it actually goes down almost like a route of this axon here. So it propagates, that's what it's called, that route. Often, if there's a myelinated axon, what ends up happening is it sort of jumps from one node to another. These are called the nodes of Ranvier. And when it does that, it speeds it up, the transmission that is. It speeds the transmission up quite a bit. So you can see that if your neurons are myelinated, they end up being really fast-acting neurons compared to ones like this one that's not myelinated. And then, as we said, when we get to the end of that axon, when it arrives at the terminal, the AP, that is the action potential, then the neurotransmitters are released. These neurotransmitters are stored in sacs at the end of this thing called a synaptic vesicle. And when the nerve impulse reaches the end of that axon, the vesicles move to the surface and release chemical messengers. And those chemical messengers go across the synapse to the next neuron. There's more than 50 kinds of identified so far, anyway, neurotransmitters. One of the most common and critical is acetylcholine, which is found in lots of systems and important for all kinds of behavior. But there's many others, and we'll probably get a chance to talk about some of those. Here's another example, norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is released in the brain, obviously, and it leads to arousal and vigilance. So if you want to be wide awake and kind of paying attention to what's going on, we have a tendency to do things that increase our norepinephrine levels, things like drinking coffee and so on. Dopamine is involved with systems that govern movement, planning, and reward. So dopamine tends to be a chemical that makes you feel pretty good in terms of planning and reward activities. Serotonin is involved in regulating sleep, our appetite, and our mood. And then there are endorphins that you've probably heard about quite a bit. These are short endorphin, meaning short for endogenous morphine, and these are sort of natural responses to pain, but they're also things that tend to make us feel pretty positive. And I think we sort of discovered or sort of discussed how the neurotransmitters travel across the synapse. So I don't think I'll go into too much detail here.